With that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to our first distinguished guest, Mike Gregerson from the Great Plains Institute, who will come, Mike, who is way ahead of schedule, as always, who will introduce Clair Moeller.
Funny faces, Ellen. I was
Thank you, Mike.
Morning. How the heck are you? Are you excited to be here? Do you know where you're at? Okay, this is the University of Minnesota main campus. Back many, many decades ago, in the old Kaufman Union, I used to play pool because I wasn't a very good engineering student, but a great pool player. So if you go down the street a bit, there is an internationally premier chemical engineering and material science building where my daughter-in-law works. She wanted me to do a plug for her. And then if you keep going down, on the back end of Williams Arena is the #1 nationally ranked University of Minnesota women's volleyball team. Whoa! So I was such a bad engineering student, I came back and got a degree second time in public health, air pollution, Jessica. Yeah, so back in the old days when they didn't have environmental engineers. So I was asked at the last minute to come here and introduce Clair Moeller. God, what a job. I started working with Clair Moeller back in 1990. Our kids swam together on the Y team. I said, I know too much about him. I can't introduce him. I could tell stories, but, you know, what the hell. So, Clair Moeller is probably one of the most intelligent, great, kind, I'm saying this to take the edge off of him this morning, people that I know. When I first came to NSP Wisconsin in 1990, I really didn't know much about the operations system and stuff. Clair was one of the people that came to me and said, what do you need? How can I help? And he's been that way ever since. When I started working with the Midwestern Governors Association in 2007, Governor Pawlenty and Governor Doyle had put together these great goals, 35,000 megawatts of wind in the Midwest, blah, blah, blah. And then afterwards, they realized, well, we don't have a clue how we're going to do this. So I volunteered to start working with them back then on basically transmission planning and all the things that needed to happen to have that do. The problem was I didn't know anything about transmission. I always worked on the, as Clair would say, the little wires, you know, that little guys work on. I went to Clair back then, and if you know Clair, you get him in front of a whiteboard, and about 4 hours later, you know, he just talks and talks. He really helped me to understand FERC and NERC and all the other things that happen, the Byzantine process that goes about on transmission planning and operation. Clair, in his career, has done many things, but I think his greatest accomplishment is he got into the Midwestern Independent System Operator at the beginning and has done one hell of a job helping them to become, I think, the premier regional transmission organization in the United States. He's persistent, he's dedicated, he's creative, and he's done a pretty incredible job, I think. Enough so that they had to change their name a few years ago and become the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, because they go all the way from Manitoba down to Louisiana now. Pretty amazing, and you'll hear more about that later today. The other part of Clair that I want to talk about is as a, I think, an incredibly dedicated person, father, husband, grandfather. I just got the 1 minute. So I was ahead of Clair for a while. I have 4 grandchildren. I only have 3 kids. He has 4. Not only did he convince them to all get engineering degrees, he now has 5 grandchildren, and I'm losing out. So And on that happy note, I'd love to introduce Clair Moeller.
I'm not actually that guy. I'm kind of a dumb old utility guy. But this is kind of like old home week. Charlie Grunwald there, Dan Jewell. I know a lot of you guys. We've worked together for a long time. Will Call's here too. He accused me of being the skunk at the garden party. Sorry. What I want to talk about a little bit is kind of who we are, what we do in a little more detail, and some observations on how we might proceed, if I can decide which button is forward. Nope, not that one. There we go. So as Mike said, we're the coast-to-coast RTO, but the two coasts are Hudson Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. And this organized energy market of this size gives us all kinds of flexibility, which we can exploit in all kinds of ways. That flexibility is a really important tool, particularly as we see the generation fleet changing. And I'll talk a little more about that later in the presentation. Where do I point this? Click. Forward. Where am I supposed to point it?
Oh, the pointer, I have no idea.
No, I just thought,
The clicker, wait, you want to point?
no, I want to proceed.
Okay.
Proceed.
Help, please? I'm the wrong person.
So the hand puppet version.
I know.
I got to go one. Okay. Hey, I don't know what happened, but it forwarded. Maybe that's it. So this is to the who we are and what we do. So in 2006, we started thinking deeply about what is your job as a kind of super regional planner. Now, I grew up at NSP. I spent 25 years there. And the planner's job always was to minimize the investment to get our generation to our load. That's how we worked on cost. But when you think about the whole of that big footprint, there's another idea that's available to you. And that's make an investment, increase the cost of transmission to make the cost of energy go down. So instead of worried about minimizing the investment, our job became minimize the bill. And that was a pretty big deal. That led us to this set of principles, and one of the things that was important about that time is the notion that policy planning is an important thing. If transmission lines take energy from someplace to someplace, and you need to understand where that's going in order to make sure you can minimize the cost for consumers to get those jobs done. Who ran off with my pointer? This is even better. Hey! So the process that we go through, and Mike alluded to this a little bit earlier, is to look at what the sum of the various states' policy goals are, because they're not all the same. They're often quite different. But look at what their policy goals are and see if there's a way to minimize the cost to achieve the sum of those policies. In the multi-value project time, it was kind of easy because most states had the same policy. So there wasn't a lot of debate about do the interests align because the policies were similar. It's less clear today than it was then, but that gave us the opportunity to look at how to minimize the cost to achieve the sum of those policies. This process started in 2007 when the governor of Minnesota and 6 of his colleagues wrote me a letter that said, your planning process is in our way. Do something about that. So we started working in 2007. In 2011, too early for the slide, back up one there. So in 2011, we proposed and our board accepted the notion that we should spend about $6 billion on electric transmission to facilitate the mostly wind, renewable mandates that the majority of our states had passed legislatively. $6 billion is a lot of money, right? If you'd have totaled up all of the value of all of the transmission system at the time, it was only $13 billion. Right, so we added $6 billion to a $13 billion base, but it was dramatically less expensive than if each state would have done it alone. And that's kind of the big aha from that. When we were doing the evaluations, we looked at all of the wind on the western side of our system, and you build the biggest transmission grid anybody ever dreamt up. Or you put all of the renewables at the load centers. Those were the 2 most expensive options. So local was too expensive, and only exploiting the best wind was too expensive. And the right answer was to distribute it across most of the footprint, because that allowed you to use that diversity that I was talking about. We had, at that time, 40,000 megawatts of interconnection requests in our queue. I think 20,000 of it was in Pipestone. We had a lot of fun. Advance the slide, please.
Sir.
Yeah, it's going to work this time?
It should, I hope. Give it a shot.
Ooh, perfect. So there was a conversation about the fleet is changing, and that's, we've got actual facts that actually show that. In 2005, when I began with MISO, 85% of the energy was, 75% of the energy was coal. By the end of last year, 46% of the energy was coal. Now, there, we had people join and people leave, and there's some, stuff behind the math. A lot of this is $3 gas, right? $3 gas in a modern plant outcompetes coal, at least in the older units. So that's an important thing. Economics are important. But based on that trajectory, then, what is the future going to look like ends up being a pretty important question. Back to that multi-value project scenario, we approved that work in 2011. The last of it will go in service in 2022. So you need to be thinking, today we need to be thinking about 2033, right? Because it actually takes that long to get that work done. So what is 2033 actually going to look like? So what we've done is pulled a piece of work out of the strategic planner's playbook and start looking at scenarios on how the future might play out. The future on my right, your left, says nothing changes except gas price goes back up. And so that's how you get more coal in the mix. It's important to notice that there's been essentially no increase in load since like 2008. So there's no load growth. We spent $6 billion on transmission, not because load was growing, but because how we made electricity was changing. So we're still headed that way. We think we see the trend kind of between the middle and the far scenario. People are continuing to decarbonize their portfolios. Essentially the political shifts have almost no effect on what utility planners are doing. They're all taking a long view. And for the most part, they're not getting trapped in the election cycles. At least that's what we think we see in these trends. Importantly, no growth is something to think about. There's some, folks that want to take credit for deferring transmission or distribution. We're not building anything because there's no growth, right? So when you're doing your business case, pay close attention to what the actual facts are, because you can make mistakes by not doing your homework. So there's our generation interconnection queue as it stands today. In total, it's about 60,000 megawatts. Our total market is about 120, and we're not growing. But I have 60,000 megawatts interconnection request. So that's that shift that we're talking about. Now, as energy production moves to the edge of the grid, the analogy that we think is true is transportation. When the jobs moved to the suburbs, we didn't build less lanes, we built more lanes because we needed more flexibility for transportation. And that's how electric transmission is looking to us right now too. If we're going to exploit that flexibility, it's a pretty important thing. You have to be able to take energy from where it's plentiful and move it to where it's scarce. And that changes geographically by the hour in a world of intermittent resources such as wind and solar. So that gets to be an important, and it's kind of a new problem. The old system operating problem was load moved and you adjusted your generation to meet it. Now both load and resource are moving, and you have to adjust the rest of the generation to make up for that flexibility. So it's becoming more complicated and, for the engineers, more fun. Interestingly, we have almost 16,000 megawatts of solar in the queue. The last time I did this slide, we had 600. Part of that is our footprint is now got solar-rich geography, right? So it doesn't snow so often in Arkansas as it does in Minnesota, right? Which Ted will come up and talk about that in a couple minutes. But that's that diversity and that opportunity for diversity that the large market footprint gives us that we're trying to learn how we might exploit so we can minimize the cost to achieve the goals that the various states have in this regard. Which brings me to the actual thing I was told to talk about, which is storage. Be careful what your purpose is before you make up your mind about what storage option is the best one for you. There are a lot of different ideas around storage. The dumb old utility guy in me liked a coal pile because that was storage. Right? You could look out the window and you could see 30 days of energy. My job was to always keep the lights on. Knowing I could do that, that was an important thing. We didn't think about it as storage. We thought, we said inventory, but it was storage. One of the things we worry about as we move forward is natural gas fired generation. You don't have on-site storage, generally. Well, what does that mean to reliability for consumers is something we're going to have to pay attention to. We've got on one natural gas pipeline about 12,000 megawatts in natural gas fired generation. Now, but pipelines don't fail very often. Only takes one. I mean, it's things we have to worry about because as an industry, the electric industry has a public safety element to it that we've kind of forgotten until, Hurricane Irma gets you. So that public safety part of the energy system is pretty important. The grid actually functions as a storage device. And I got an example that I'm going to go through with some numbers to illustrate that. So we took we call it a hypothetical municipal utility. It's an actual municipal utility whose name has been changed to protect me. If they were going to do 100% annual wind compared to their load, that's actual data. That's what it looks like. So you have to manage that resource volatility to keep the load, which is pretty steady, working. So we did some numbers. I said, let's take that 150 megawatt utility and let's microgrid it, cut it off from the grid, and see what you'd have to do to make it work. If you just did solar, now this hypothetical utility was in Iowa, if you just did solar and battery and you were cut off from the grid, this 65,000 person town would have to spend $200 billion on storage because of the pattern of solar. Okay, well, nobody do that, that's stupid. How about if we just do wind? Much better, it's only $100 billion, right? Because you've got a seasonal variation in renewable energy that's non-trivial. In the case of wind, you have to charge all winter so you can use all summer. And so the size of the battery in terms of how its instantaneous output isn't so big, but boy, you gotta have a lot of energy. The costs in this, we used a recently installed cost of a battery. You wanna say batteries are gonna be half that cost, right? So it's 50 billion, right? So it's still a really big number. The value in batteries is in a faster time horizon, and Lynn is going to talk about her actual experience, a colleague of mine from Indiana. We'll talk about all the great things a battery is, but this is one of the great things a battery isn't. So, okay, let's find a cheaper way. So combining solar and wind, that's a good thing because the pattern is more solar in the summer and more wind in the winter. That brought the price down to a mere $50 billion. Then we said, okay, let's oversupply with generation. So capture as much as you can, actually shed wind, curtail solar, and only use the batteries for the time you can't get enough either wind or solar. And that was a $6 billion answer. Now, go back to the multi-value projects. We spent $6 billion to put 25,000 megawatts on the grid. This is $6 billion, so you can get 700 megawatts. Money matters. A town of 65,000 hasn't got that kind of money. But you connect them to the grid. In this case, there's sufficient transmission. There's no new investment there. It's about a $500 million for the windmills. Because essentially when they oversupply, they put that energy in the market. When they're undersupply, they buy it from the market. And we're storing that energy essentially in deferred traditional gas-fired generation. That's staying in the ground or it's going into gas storage when they don't need it. That's a really big deal in terms of our ability to integrate renewables. We've got an enormous battery that is almost free. So before we get to 100%, let's get to 60% or 80% and give some time for the rest of this technology to evolve. Let's not start at the end, let's move towards the end, and I think we'll be, our consumers will be better served. An amount of time. Here's a real cool chart. So the kind of the punchline is we continue to work on this. There are a lot of uses for storage and what we call ancillary services, which is essentially a short time horizon, 30 minutes and less. It is a really good tool. How to express that value in that wholesale market is something we're still kind of struggling with. Keep working on that. Every once in a while we throw paper at each other and go to FERC and argue. But the important thing is to discern the value and make sure that value gets effectively represented so that the business cases to make these big investments stand the test of time, right? The worst thing we can do for consumers is make bad investments in good ideas. That's why we're all here. That's what planning's about. And I think I'm done. I'm done.
I don't get to ask any questions. I haven't started and I'm out of time. So, we're at the University of Minnesota. A moment of silence. Cassini went into Saturn. It's gone. 20-year incredible project. Probably one of the most amazing technological advancements ever. So,
You did tell them you're like a rocket scientist. That's why that's important to you.
okay. I was an aerospace engineer for 1 year.
Claire?
Thank you.
All right, now I'm going to do the official part. Thank you, Mike, for the context. And Claire, how long can you stick around? A few, till 10:30?
No, I've got a 10 o'clock appointment, so
Okay.
I'm almost out the door already.
Thank you so much for setting the stage here for our Midwest conversation, and we really appreciate it. Let's thank Clair Moeller. And I apologize for getting behind schedule so you don't get any Q&A. Sorry about that. But grab him, if you can, in the next few minutes. I have 2 quick announcements. For those who are sitting near an aisle, could you scoot over? Because we have people trying to sit down and they can't really get into seats. So if you could try to move over to the middle of each section, then we'll be able to seat our incoming guests, whom we have a lot of. What was my other announcement, Eric? Oh, yes. Questions. If you have questions and you write them down on the card, just hold them up in the air any time between now and 4 o'clock, and someone will come around and get them. You know, hopefully before your arm is too tired.